Hey all, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to create conditional HX triggers based on element visibility with HTMX. So I recently released 1 million checkboxes, a globally synced display of 1 million checkboxes using HTMX to drive the UI. Now under the hood, it uses polling to re-render sections of the grid. However, rendering everything at once is too costly, about 5 megabytes per reload, which is like, several large pictures worth. And we're doing this like every few seconds, so like quite a lot of bandwidth. And so I needed to implement conditionals to only pull UI section it needs, which brings this down to about 3.6 kilobytes per reload, or, less than 1/1000th of the full page reload. And this happens based on what the user's browser is looking at, because if you're not looking at the element, then you probably wouldn't benefit from it reloading because you're not even going to see that it reloaded in the first place. Now I implemented this using HTMX's trigger conditionals to call a custom function which determines if the target element is visible or not. And here we'll explore how this works so that you can implement something in your own app. All right, so first let's start off with an overview of 1 million checkboxes to give you a better idea of how this visibility conditional works and fits into the broader ecosystem. And so basically what the site is it's a display of 1 million checkboxes. It split its grid into sections of 1,000 checkboxes. I'll show you how this looks in a minute. But you can imagine it's just a big grid of checkboxes. And each is split into a section, and each of those sections basically gets a unique ID, which we are going to use as an HTMX target. And then it also has its own HTMX poller using HX trigger. And then on trigger, it checks if it's visible using these HTMX conditionals. And if so, it fetches the new version of the grid and swaps it out for inner HTML. And so main thing to note is like million checkboxes split into 1,000 grids, each of 1,000 checkboxes, and each of these has like these HTMX controls to allow it to re-render itself. And if you're familiar with server islands or interactive islands, it's kind of similar to that, where we have these subcomponents that understand how to handle their own interactivity. And so the grid HTML basically looks like this. This is one of those subsection grids. And so here we have the ID of the format, checkbox grid with the start index here. Here we're saying, how do you get the new grid with HX get? And we have start here. We don't actually use this parameter, but it's really nice for debugging to see like what is it actually rendering for. Then we set the HX target. It's targeting itself using its ID. Then we're saying, hey, when you get the new HTML out, we want you to swap it with the inner HTML. And so we're not replacing this stuff because we know it doesn't need to change. In fact, it's probably better if it stays the same. And then we only render out the stuff that does change, which is the checkbox HTML. Then we declare the HX trigger, and we're doing polling with the every keyword, and it's some amount of seconds. I have it as like slightly random to kind of avoid the thundering herd issue of like everything trying to re-render at once. And then we set up the conditional here inside these brackets, which is element visible, is the custom function that I made, and then it passes in itself using its ID. Finally, I just have some Tailwind styles here because, I use Tailwind to style it. And so that's what it looks like, but I also want to show you, how this is running in production so you can get a better idea of like how this works, and also some proof that it actually works the way I'm telling you. Okay, so here's 1 million checkboxes at 1millioncheckboxes.xyz, and basically the idea is that if I make changes over here, it will show up over here, and if I make changes over here, it'll show up over here, and so that's how we're getting globally synced checkboxes using HTMX. Now under the hood, we can see that we have like a ton of checkboxes. You can see that the scroll is pretty large, and if I roll down here, we can see we've just got like a ton of grids. I lazy load them because I don't want to send you 5 megabytes if you're not going to use 5 megabytes. But then as soon as you go and look at them, we can see that they're loading. Now I have these markers here to make it easier to see like where in the grid you are, and so I'm currently at 996,000, and we can see that these requests are only coming for 995 and 996, and this is because I can see 995 up here, and then I can see 996 here. And so this is how we're actually doing these conditionals. It's looking at the viewport, being like, which parts of the grid, really which divs can you see? And I'm only going to allow those ones to trigger themselves. All right, so now let's talk about HTMX conditionals on element visibility. And so HTMX allows conditional triggering with the syntax HX trigger, and then you mark the trigger, but then you say a conditional. And basically what it's saying is like, here's the trigger. So this would be plugged in to something. It might be like an event, might be like an every, stuff like that. It's going to try to trigger, but then before it actually does the thing, it's going to be like, well, let me just evaluate what's inside this conditional here. Now, HTMX currently does not have a built-in conditional for whether the element is visible, so I had to roll my own. I have seen several issues on the HTMX thing, several discussions about this where people would like this, and it seems like it probably will be included at some point because it is so commonly useful, but for now it doesn't exist. And so the way that this function works, is element visible, and it basically takes in a reference to an HTML element and tries to determine if the element is visible by comparing the window with the bounding box of the element. Now, honestly, this API is pretty confusing as both the window and element positions appear to change on scroll, but I've cross-referenced it with several answers and it works in prod, so this seems to work as expected. And so here's the function in its entirety. If you just want to come and copy and paste it, you just got the function here. It takes in an element. I'm basically passing in the ID here, but then somehow in the browser, it's turning this into an element, so I don't have to search for it myself. I don't know how that works, but this is how it works. We just have a guard here, and then we get the bounding box of the element here. And basically what we're doing is we compare element top with the window's inner height, and this is how we're able to see if it's inside the window or not. And looking at this, it appears that all element positions are with respect to the window itself, and so that's what's happening. But I took this from the Stack Overflow answer linked here after trying multiple different answers, and this is the one that seemed to work the best. And then just for completeness, how do we actually call this function with HTMX? Well, I already showed you how it's in the conditional in the HX trigger, but basically you need to somehow get this function on your page. And so this could be a script tag or an import. Basically what I'm doing is I have a little JS file with all of my little JS functions I need, and then I just include it in a script tag in the same way that I include HTMX at the top of the page, which makes it available on the page wherever I need it. And then finally, you hook it into the HX trigger there with the conditional. Next. So you can see this code in action yourself on 1 million checkboxes. And if you like this post, you might also like 1 million checkboxes, globally synced data with HTMX, a little bit more background on how it's built, why I built it this way, stuff like that. You might also be interested in simple interactive islands with F# and HTMX, more about how I'm actually using HTMX in prod, kind of the design philosophy around interactive islands or server islands, which is a bit different than how you might be used to building with spas. And then finally, you might be interested in what it's like to run HTMX in production, stories from experienced software engineers. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.